do a different recommendation. And I think the perception and the reality pretty well have matched up here over the last 10 years, which is that, or 20 years, which is that staff never sees a development project that they aren't going to recommend to the ZAB. And I think that the community input needs to be earlier than the ZAB for many of the projects, and then we wouldn't end up with so much litigation and contention over these projects if the community were involved early.
So just three things. One, an overarching thing I'm also hearing is that input, engaging neighborhoods regarding development applications early in the process is needed. And one of the things that I talked about during my campaign for mayor that I want to work to implement is a required neighborhood pre-meeting. Usually you put your plans and go around and get them signed off, but we should build in, and we do this, our staff do encourage major applicants to do this already, but it should be the requirement to build into the application process that you have to do some community process before you are able to have your major application being complete by the planning staff. So that's something that we could potentially build in. Two other specific points relating to the Claremont neighborhood. I oppose the volleyball project as it's presently proposed, and we'll talk about how the city can engage in the process because we do have some legal standing. And I think it's gonna, I'm not sure at the end of the day that the university is going to pull back the project, but if they don't pull back the project, the city has a very strong hand to try to negotiate mitigations for the neighborhood. And so I think we want to hear the neighborhood's input about what would be appropriate mitigations in that specific circumstance. But I don't support the project. I think violence covers this very clearly. And then I want to know that the university currently has they're in an environmental review process right now and the EIR should be out next month, I believe, for two things. For a housing project connected to the Golden School Code policy up there on, what is it?
Hurst and Wallowa.
Hurst and Wallowa. But the university snuck in to the notice of preparation for this project a fix of their substantial lack of compliance with the 2020 long-range development plan. The 2020 long-range development plan set goals and set targets for how much housing to be built, how much population, so that the campus can plan its needs, its space needs, population needs. There are 11,000 more students that have come to the campus since the long-range development plan was adopted in 2005. What has the university done to fix that? And what is their compliance with the existing mitigations in the LRDP EIR? So I want you to know the city is following this very closely, and we will be participating in the environmental impact process. And I believe this does afford the city an opportunity to negotiate real mitigations for the impacts on our roads, traffic, public safety that we have experienced over the last 10 years. So I want everyone to know that process is going on right now. We encourage everyone to weigh in. The university needs to hear from the city and from the citizens of Berkeley that we expect them to address the impacts that they've created on our city. So, that was longer than
Who's next?
It's
Janice.
yeah. So I want to ask something of the city planner. I have a very simple suggestion that can happen to get neighborhood input earlier on in the project, and that is, why can't the city planner come to the meeting the developer is required to hold with the neighborhood groups? They come, they present their project, we bring up information, concerns, and then the developer just takes those and writes that they have a meeting. And then we go to design review, we go to ZAB, we say, these are the concerns that we brought up early on in the project, and none of them have been addressed. So that's one simple suggestion I have. As far as coordination between departments, one question I have for planning is, why is the area plan that we are spending so much money on to develop, not put into the zoning code. And so we go to ZAG and we say, well, the South Area Plan says we're supposed to have so much open space, and ZAG says, oh, well, that's not in the code, so we can't do anything about it. I feel like we're spending a lot of time and effort in getting all the community input to make these plans, and then they're unenforceable. Okay, so then the other question I have, and I'm glad that transportation is here too, I'm supposed to talk about the 3000 Shattuck project, and I think this is related also to the Berkeley Hills project with the narrow streets. Why can't we have traffic make, requirements, like, maybe there shouldn't be parking on the street, on these narrow streets. I mean, I don't know, I'm not that familiar with that concern, but as far as 3000 Shattuck goes, Shattuck and Ashby is a very busy intersection. And one of the concerns the neighbors brought up was that there was going to be an issue building 80 bedrooms on the corner of Shattuck and Ashby that don't have parking and don't have any kind of loading zone. And we had a meeting, conference call with Greg Powell, and we said, there's no loading zone. What is the plan here? How are these 80 people going to be getting on their lifts and Ubers? How is Amazon going to be delivering their packages? They have no cars. How are they going to be, moving into their apartments, moving out of their apartments? It was, obviously not thought out. And we were told at the ZAB meeting that they talked to traffic, and the traffic engineer said they could put in a loading zone on either Ashby or Shattuck, and this would not be an issue. Ashby is, at ZAB, they pointed out that Ashby is controlled by Caltrans, and the city can't just put in a loading zone there, but that's what was presented at the meeting. So it didn't seem like traffic ever heard our concerns, and it waited till it got to the ZAB meeting before, the traffic report all says everything's fine. There were going to be less car traffic because the gas station had more trips per day than this building was going to generate. And they never listened to the neighbors who said that was going to be an issue. I mean, I could give you other examples. I mean, one is the Parker, and they say that the traffic backs up into the parking garage because of the way that the residents are forced to make a left turn onto Shattuck and the traffic light, only 6 cars fit. This was brought up in neighborhood meetings long before the project went to ZAB, and neighbors said this was going to be an issue, and lo and behold, it's an issue. So I hope that you guys can kind of talk to me about how traffic and planning coordinate, and how can neighbors, get more input.
Sure. Just to touch briefly on the narrow streets in the hillside area, the map that was brought up, something I think was developed by our department along with the Disaster Fire Safety Commission's efforts. Taking away parking in the hillside is a very sensitive issue. The residents use it, they don't want to lose it, but they also want emergency response access. So that's something that has been ongoing. There have been discussions about having red flag day, no parking restriction. How do we communicate that out to people so it actually occurs on those high fire danger days that people don't park on the street? Where are they going to park? Hasn't been entirely resolved, but that's something that we're very sensitive to. Relative to individual projects, we've gotten away from, it used to be that the California Environmental Quality Act required a minimum amount of parking, or that if you didn't provide enough parking for the parking demand generated by your project, that was an impact, had to be addressed in some way. CEQA has gotten away from that requirement. That's no longer significant criteria for impacts. So really it comes down to what is the city's code requirement for parking. If they don't build it, they're supposed to pay parking in lieu fees. The reason that we don't want to overbuild parking is that tends to lead to a lot more traffic, trip generation. So less parking, getting people using bikes and transit and other local transportation options is great, but you find a pain point where that some parking demand still occurs and it moves on street. So that's something that we're always trying to balance. The issues with regards to the loading zone, if we can't do it on Ashby, if Caltrans says no, we can put it onto Shattuck. Certainly, that's within our jurisdiction. We can control that. All of the projects, we really try to take a look at what they need for loading. Certainly, if it's a commercial project, we're always pushing for off-street loading zones. On-street loading zones are very challenging. The tendency for them to get misused, we end up with people doing loading activities in bus stops that interferes with transit. So you raise very good points, and those are things that we do try to address as early on in the process as we can. The more they're brought to our attention, certainly we'll focus our efforts there, but the traffic engineers are trying to look for those.
I guess my question is, why didn't a traffic engineer ever talk to us? I mean, when they say they could put in a loading zone, both Shattuck merges from 2 lanes to 1 lane in both directions at that intersection, and Ashby merges from 2 lanes to 1 lane at that intersection. I don't understand how they could ever put in a loading zone on either side of that building, and that's why it got turned down. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it got turned down by ZAB. It seems like it never should have, that a traffic engineer should have seen that, and the fact that neighbors were saying it, I don't understand what more we could have done.
I think that's a question for you, Kevin.
I'm going to address it. I might not even need this. So, in this case, the traffic engineer did consider this, and so all we can do as traffic engineers on Fareed's team is interpret the rules, look at the project, apply the project to the rules. The interpretation in this case was that a loading zone could happen on either one of those areas. Clearly, there's disagreement with that interpretation, but that analysis was done and a recommendation was made. And so that's how that process happens. There's a lot of coordination between the planning staff and the traffic staff, all the way through an application, a permit application, use permit application. And so could that coordination get better? It can always be better. We're dedicated to continuous improvement. But sometimes it just comes down to a decision that either a planner makes or a decision makes, depending on what the issue is. And not everybody always agrees with that decision, but then that's what's debated at the ZAB meeting, or in this case, it'll be debated also at a city council meeting. So there's opportunity for the public to participate in that debate.
Okay, we're going to go back to Janice again, only this time on the Honda project.
Okay. So can people hear me? I think I'm fine without the mic. Well, that's a very good segue then, because the issue then is code enforcement. So what you're saying is that, we can make recommendations, and if the decision is made that this is going to be fine, and then it's not fine, it comes down to, we've gone to city council and said, what can we do about this? And planning's response has always been that code enforcement is complaint driven. And so we had this whole discussion at one of the city council meetings about how it's up to the neighbors to take pictures, to document things. We've had staff members ask us, well, how many accidents are there at that intersection? And, have you guys kept a log of this? And so, the neighbors feel like code enforcement is not our job, and it puts us at odds with the business that's, coming up in that area. And one of the things with the Honda project was, you have boilerplate rules about how construction should be, and the light should be shaded, and there should only be this one fan, and it should be so many feet from the neighbors. Well, the neighbors ended up complaining that these conditions were not being met, and the planning department's response was to write it all up and send it to Honda. And that's what was told to the neighbors at the meeting. And they never heard from the neighbors again, and the planning department said that the neighbors had stopped complaining, so they assumed that all the issues had been resolved. And so then the neighbors had to come back and say, well, we stopped complaining because we thought you were addressing it, and it gets to this back and forth issue where I don't think the neighbors are always being heard, and I don't know how that there should be some basic code enforcement that's not relying on the neighbors to complain.
So thank you for that. I think that's a really good point, and I actually agree that our process of code enforcement needs to be evaluated and continuously improved. Not only for a project like Honda, but there's several projects where, for example, a project might get its entitlements and maybe change hands.
Yep.
There's a long list of conditions of approval associated with that project. And if it's a condition of approval on the permit, you're right, those conditions do have to be enforced. I think the thing that we struggle with as a city is how do you effectively enforce conditions and all of the other aspects of our code with the resources that we have, right? And so a lot of the times, that's why the process is largely complaint driven, because you would need multiple armies of code enforcement officers to be driving around the city or biking around the city at all times, looking for conditions that aren't being implemented effectively. And obviously, there's never going to be the resources needed to do that type of enforcement. So we do rely on community members notifying us of complaints. And when a complaint is received by the city, my department coordinates with the city manager's office where the code enforcement unit exists. And code enforcement officers go out and investigate, and notify the property owner, yes, you are out of compliance with this condition, you need to correct it. In some cases, that leads to a notice of violation. In some cases, it leads to a citation. Where I'm focusing is, as a relatively new planning director, is how do we make that process a bit more efficient and actually more proactive, right? And
Yeah.
more proactive. And one of the ways that I'm hopeful that we can do that over the next several months is make that connection between the planning and the code enforcement unit a bit more, a bit stronger, so that when conditions are on a project and that project then goes to construction, there's very clear reminders, very clear and consistent information from the city to the project team what those conditions are, and reinforcement of those need to be proactively implemented before the project gets built, right? Before the project gets built. And I think you're right. I think that is something that the city can improve on.
So one other follow-up on that is that even when the neighbors did give a list of concerns, I don't think that any code enforcement person ever went out at night to see if the lights were shaded. And, that was one of the complaints. Also, the thing about the parking and the double parking. And, I just drove down Martin Luther King on Sunday morning, and there was a box truck offloading in front of the cafe space at Trader Joe's. It backed up all the traffic on Martin Luther King through North Berkeley. And that truck was just sitting there loading. And, planning told us we should call the police when we see things like this happening. I don't think the police really want to.
It depends on the thing. It depends on what the issue is. Some issues are better addressed by planning, some by code enforcement, and some by police. I think what you're touching on is the challenge of if there's a box truck on MLK on Saturday morning or Sunday morning, whenever it is, the best mechanism for that, unless there's a city staff person there at that time, we have to depend on someone telling us about it. And when someone tells us about it, we have to effectively respond to that complaint. So there is a reason for the complaint-driven process. It's not just that we don't want to do anything about it. We
Right.
want you to tell us about it.
So if we take a picture of the license plate, are you gonna go do something about it?
Anytime we get a complaint, code enforcement absolutely goes out and analyzes that and looks at that issue. Code enforcement has been out to Honda probably over a dozen times.
And nothing's changed?
Yeah. That's not true.
Okay, I'd like to remind everyone that we have to be out of here at 12. Absolutely true. So we need to move on
You
and,
need to go to Christopher.
yeah, good.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for coming here and talking to residents. We appreciate it very much. I have a few questions that relate, I think, to neighborhood input and the potential problems of enforcement issues. So first, let me talk about the hotel at 1499 University. This was originally permitted back in 2011 and 2014. It, at that time, did not include an open-air deck on the roof. When it was looked at as a whole organically, due to various concerns of neighbors. It's about 60 feet, this deck would be 60 feet or so from nearby homes and apartments, and it's built in a hotel that did not design a commercial event space. And the original developer plans included a rooftop kitchen, so neighbors were concerned that this could become a rented event space for this hotel. The original ZAB permit sounded really great, and ZAB was fully behind this space not being the hotel's commercial event space, rented out to anyone. But the ZAB write-up done by city staff have a lot of, you could call them loopholes or errors or problems, such as the deck being used, quote, for hotel guests only, which sounded really good, but it turns out legally could actually have been anyone. During the appeal to the city, many other things became difficult for us as residents. Like this project was listed under the wrong address in the agenda, and this was only corrected 72 hours before the ground deadline, despite the neighbors asking for it to be changed, which made coordinating support very difficult. Also, the resolution and supporting documents submitted by staff to the council for a vote was like 50 pages long. It's a very big thing, but in the fine print, if the council actually adopted it, it actually totally invalidated the entire ZAB set of conditions also. There would be no conditions at all. And later, the legal notice of decision was sent out with two different and contradictory sets of conditions for use of the deck. One was very permissive, that would have allowed events. Another that actually followed the city council and ZAB language and intentions not to allow events. So for the residents, this process of engaging with the city was kind of disheartening. It felt like we were engaging with an arm of the hotel developer and not quite an impartial umpire for the city planning and staff. How do you all feel about this experience, that at least from the residents' point of view, that we had? And are there any specific changes to the process of ZAB approval and council appeal that could improve this? One specific suggestion I might have is to have a knowledgeable elected official, perhaps the ZAB chair, someone with experience, actually involved with staff in the writing of the specific language, particularly the conditions of use and use permits. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this experience we've had. I guess particularly you, Tim. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. A couple of things. One is if a notice is improperly, if there's a mistake on the notice or on the report, that's inexcusable and something that shouldn't happen. And so you stated that happened in this process, and I apologize for that. That should not be something that happens. That's an administrative error that we need to make sure does not happen. In terms of the process, your questions again speak to this issue, I think, of the role of staff and sort of the process more generally. What staff's goal was, and always is, was to apply that project to the zoning code, apply the zoning code to that project, and then make a determination based on our research and our analysis, and then make a recommendation to ZAB. The process is designed for ZAB to consider that recommendation and make a decision on it, and then for that recommendation to then be appealed. And in this scenario, that is what happened in this process, right? Neighbors expressed concerns about the rooftop deck. Several of those concerns were addressed during the appeal process. You probably didn't get everything that you wanted, but maybe you got some of what you wanted. And essentially, that's what the process is designed to do. And yes, it needs to be more efficient. Yes, we need to eliminate mistakes from that particular project. But in this case, staff made a recommendation to ZAB. ZAB made a decision. It was appealed. Council had to consider it. Community members got to state their concerns about that project. They were addressed. And hopefully, as a result of that multi-stage process of community input, the process got better, or the project got better because of it. And that's what it's designed. That's what it's designed to do. You probably didn't get everything that you wanted, but you did have an opportunity to participate in the process.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that's a fair answer. From our point of view, it's also true that if some of these errors hadn't been introduced, or the language had been perhaps more impartially written up in the original ZAB permit, none of that would have needed to happen. And it's a very both expensive and drawn out and confrontational process that basically turns residents off to engaging with the city. It would have been much better to, if possible, get it sort of done right in the beginning. This would be my answer to that, although I appreciate what you say, which is also correct.
Absolutely.
What you say is correct.
Absolutely.
Okay, second question related to this 1499 University Hotel. The logic behind the decision to allow this rooftop deck was a little unusual. So a restroom is a key element to this deck, and it would allow the deck to be used for all kinds of commercial purposes. The deck is all above the height limit, and anything above the height limit cannot, under Berkeley Municipal Code, be used for commercial purposes. And the hotel already has like 40 other restrooms. So staff decided that this rooftop restroom was a non-commercial use of space, despite it being part of a tourist hotel. And the logic presented was that as long as the restroom is not used for some other and different commercial purpose, like a restaurant or basically some other business, a bike shop, anything, as long as it's not used for some other and different type of commercial use, then it is a non-commercial use of space, even though the entire building is a commercial enterprise. And some city staff admitted to us afterward that this logic may cause problems. It sort of sets up every commercial rooftop in Berkeley as a potential enforcement problem now, because structures for commercial use can be built above the height limit everywhere, and then it becomes a problem of policing and enforcing specifically how they're used, if that makes sense. I could say there's another kind of absurd consequence that it leads to, which is like a hotel could be denied a deck and a restroom for a sandwich shop on the roof, but that same thing would be allowed in a restaurant.